The world is rapidly shedding its rural past. On May 23, 2007, we reached a long-awaited milestone anticipated by demographers across the globe. For the first time in history, more than half the human population, or more than 3.3 billion people, lived in urban areas. This is more people than the entire population of the world in 1967. At the current rate, the number of urbanites will exceed 5 billion, or over 60% of the global population, by 2030. While this trend offers the opportunity for many positive aspects, it will also present unforeseen challenges for much of the world. This stark fact is inevitable, and it must be considered at all levels of government planning, particularly in the areas of economic, environment, and security. After surviving for over 3,500 years, the urban trend is unlikely to disappear in the next 50. Africa's migration stems from the numerous civil wars and the subsequent waves of refugees into the European Union. In the 1990s, there was a major increase in involuntary or forced migration, and in the middle of the decade, refugees and internally displaced persons in some countries outnumbered voluntary international migrants by a ratio of more than 2 to 1. Europe is a host to a population of 56.1 million immigrants. That now surpasses North America, who hosts 40.8 million immigrants. Europe is recruiting migrants to fill labor and skill shortages, and these shortages are predicted to rise in coming years. Latin America's adoption of neoliberal policies had an effect on production processes, labor markets, and income distribution. Many of the countries have high levels of urbanization and gigantic primary cities. Rural to urban migration flows have decreased, and most of the country's urban to urban migration is today the dominant form of spatial mobility. The United States receives 4 immigrants for every 1,000 Americans on average each year. Mexico represents the largest source of migration, followed by the Philippines and Latin America. Migration in the United States, which is closely tied to job opportunities, has slowed due to the current recession from its peak of 16% in 2006 to 15% in 2008. Most long-distance moves are linked to job opportunities, so when job losses mount, more people stay where they are. Canada is experiencing a higher pace of new immigrants than other industrialized countries. Roughly 6.7 newcomers per 1,000 Canadians, of which 4 out of 5 are living in cities. About 90% of the growth seen across the country was in Canada's 33 metropolitan centers. With the exception of a small number of economic sectors, China largely functions outside the world system, and yet it has undergone major and rapid urban development in recent years, with 3/4 of all population movements being from rural to urban areas. This is despite the operation of a strict residential registration system that attempts to control internal migration. Cities are powerful magnets for displaced peasants whose annual incomes depended on the uncertainties of the weather and on income distribution decisions by the collective leadership of the communes. Urban development in China is largely occurring from within as a consequence of the adjustment from a rigid and traditionally repressive rural subsistence to a more open and liberal service-based urban economy. And lastly, Australia's population grew by its fastest rate in the last 12 months by almost 500,000 people, just over 2%, the highest number of migrants from outside the country since World War II. Rural to urban migrants, international migrants, refugees, and displaced persons differ from place to place in many ways, reflecting the circumstances surrounding their moves. They vary in culture, language, and demographic and socioeconomic characteristics. At the same time, these groups have much in common. Understanding these differences and commonalities will help governments make provisions for the millions of people who move from one place to another.